In a world full of darkness, it's time to let the light shine bright. This is Strength to Overcome, where faith and action help us grow through adversity.
G'day everyone, welcome back to the Strength to Overcome podcast. I'm Matt Morton, your host, and I'm really blessed to be back with you for another episode. This week it's number 53, and I've wrestled with this, and I think you'll understand as I dive in a little bit, but have you ever really caught yourself wishing that you could go back? Maybe back to a relationship or back to a career, back to when life was a little bit simpler, or maybe even back before the diagnosis, before the divorce, before the injury, before the financial collapse, before life changed, or maybe back to a version of yourself that somehow you felt was more alive than the person looking back in the mirror at yourself today. I've actually hesitated to record this episode, and that's because when I look back at my own life, I realize that I've done a lot of looking back. In fact, I've physically gone back to a lot of places that I had already left. Back in 1994, more than 3 decades ago, I made the decision to leave school early before completing it to become a carpenter. The following year, I was actually fortunate enough to be awarded the Apprentice Graduate of the Year at my entire technical college across all trades. And I continued to work in that trade for the next 8 years, learning my craft from a lot of really great human beings that I came to love and respect. And then I walked away from it. I left my home city, I left my home state, and I moved halfway around the country. And eventually I actually left Australia altogether and moved to America. Then I went back to Australia. Then I packed up everything and went back to America. I left one career only to discover that parts of that career would eventually become valuable again later in life, which my parents had always said, you'll always have a trade to fall back on. I even went back to try and save my first marriage, and I gave that absolutely everything I had. I eventually moved away to Mexico, only to find out that somehow I ended up coming right back again. And I went back to some of the same places that I'd lived, some of the work that I'd done, some of the relationships that I'd had, and even some of the roads that I maybe thought I'd left forever. My circle came back all the way around as if I was on a roundabout, right? More than once. Which is why I really hesitated with this episode and calling it Stop Looking Back, You're Not Going That Way, because apparently sometimes I have. But I think if you'll stay with me, you'll understand what I'm really trying to get across today and why it's been so hard for me to maybe share this. Because going back to a place or a career or even a relationship isn't necessarily the same thing as going backwards. You can return somewhere without necessarily being the same person who left. And sometimes looking back just gives us that perspective that we need to move forward differently. Now, I want to also be careful here because I think there is value in looking back, because I look back to remember my mum and dad who have both passed away, and it can be a lot of sadness in there. And I look back on my life and remember some people that have come, they've shaped my life, they've encouraged me, they've challenged me, maybe helped me through tough times, but then they become part of just another chapter. And those memories do matter. They remind me where I've come from, and those people remind myself to always look at just how much impact they had on me and not to leave that behind. And of course, one day when my life is over, I hope that my 2 daughters, who are currently 4 and 6, will look back and they'll remember me too. The adventures, the conversations, the lessons, the good times, the bad times, maybe even some of the mistakes that we've learned from each other as I learn to become a dad and don't get it always right. Certainly not. Because I think memories are one of our life's greatest gifts. And so I don't think looking back is the problem, but living there is. And to me, there's a huge difference between remembering and refusing to move forward because of that. So to explain what I'm talking about, I want to go back to 2003. I was living in Australia. I was working as a carpenter. I'd moved from Melbourne to Brisbane, and I'd been in the trade for 8 years, and it was my career. It's what I knew. It's what I was good at. And if you looked at my life on paper, the roadmap, it looked pretty straightforward. Keep renovating homes, keep working in the cabinet business, keep doing shop fitting, keep earning a living. I was married, just keep doing what I'd already known and been doing for years before that. And there's nothing wrong with that road at all when I look back at it. But there was something inside of me that kept telling me there was another chapter waiting. And I didn't understand what it was because at the time I was falling in love with the health and fitness business, learning to work out, going from 125 pounds at 6'1" up to 200 pounds. That's a lot of weight to put on. And I enjoyed the process and going through it, but also loved being around people and helping people, always had, and helping people become better versions of themselves. Even through my carpentry career, it started to show up. And so I made a decision that probably looked ridiculous to a lot of people at the time. I walked away from that 8 years of carpentry and I went back to school. And that was tough because we had to make adjustments in our home. We had a mortgage. And so it was a big leap of faith. And looking back, it might look like just a simple career change, but there was some logistics. There were some challenges there because I'd invested 8 years to become really good at something. And I was just walking away from it. That's not an easy decision. It's not something you just do overnight. A lot of people question me, and you've got family kind of looking at you wondering what the hell's wrong with you. Friends that have become convinced you're losing your mind. And I think it's sometimes, if you can be honest with you, you do start questioning yourself too when you make those big decisions, right? But I couldn't help shake that feeling that I was meant to do something slightly different, even though I didn't know exactly where it was going to lead. And so I finished my certification after a year of that process, going to the Australian Institute of Fitness and working with lecturers and presenters and incredibly smart people in a lot of different areas of the health and fitness industry. And so at the time, my ex-wife, but my wife at the time, and I had to make a big decision because we always wanted to travel. And we were trying to figure it out whether we were going to live on a cruise ship and travel the world and do that. And I knew something about the personal training industry that a lot of it, or most of it's built on relationships. You don't just, collect a bunch of clients. You actually have to build trust. You got to build a reputation. You hear about their struggles. You celebrate their victories, their losses. You get to know their family. You become part of their lives. You travel with them. And I knew that if I started that process in Australia, it would be hard to then just, dump it off and take off again. And so before establishing my career in that field, we packed it all up and put it in my sister's garage, the whole home, got rid of a bunch of stuff and packed the rest into a couple of suitcases. And we moved to America in early 2004. And I started working at the Roanoke Athletic Club in Southern Virginia. And it was my first job training in the States. And honestly, I loved it because this facility had people everywhere. We had racquetball courts, basketball courts, we had pools. And so for the next 18 months, I was building this life there and just loving it because I got to have a lot of fun between sessions and got to know a lot of members, even those that I, wasn't necessarily working with. And we made friends, right? And so I enjoyed going to work, life was unfolding in the right path that you think it's meant to, right? I had a momentum. I had purpose. There was definitely stability there. Then my wife and I began talking about, okay, well, maybe we need to move back to Australia because the people in the home that we had rented it to were moving out. Everything that had lined up for us to come was now starting to do the reverse for us to come home because the trainer that had helped get me into the fitness business was moving back to New Zealand, and he had a book of clients. There was a position for my wife at the time that was lining up, and it just felt right. The roadmap seemed to be opening up for us to go home. On paper, it looked perfect. All the pieces were coming together for us to have gone to America, and then the pieces were almost reversing themselves for us to get back. And so we did. We packed everything up in America, and we moved back to Australia, back into our home. And for a few months, everything was cruising. Everything was working out just the way we thought it would. I started training the clients. She started up in her career in some management in the hospitality field, and everything was unfolding the way we thought it was going to, but something felt off. We'd made some great friends in America at the time, and it just felt like we were missing something. And so there was no event, there was no dramatic collapse of an idea. It just felt slightly off. I don't even know what word to use, because it was a conversation we kind of both had to look at each other and say, yeah, I felt it too, but I don't really know how to put my finger on it. And life doesn't always give you a detailed explanation of why you're feeling away. So you have to wrestle with that, right? It says, hey, it's time to keep on moving. And so after a couple of months, we packed everything back up again. And for those that have moved or sold a home or relocated internationally, I mean, it's a lot of work. And so we, this time, sold a lot of our stuff, did it all again differently, but still ultimately packed our lives into a couple of suitcases, and we moved back to America. And so this is mid 2005 now, and we've just moved back across the world again for the third time in 18 months. And we ended up back in Roanoke. We had been living with her mother the first time around in the basement. Beautiful home on 50 acres. It was amazing. But this time we decided, okay, let's buy a house. Let's get into town. And so I ended up back at the same place. I ended up back at the Roanoke Athletic Club. A lot of my clients came back. The relationships were still there. The trust was still there. The reputation that I had built was still there. I'd left on good terms. And so I was very familiar with it. Now, I wasn't, of course, the same man, but I came back with more perspective, more experience, more confidence. You know, I wasn't going backwards in this case. I was returning to a familiar place, but even that move created a different version of me, a different person. And so over the next couple of years, we really settled in this time, right? We bought the townhouse. I ended up becoming one of the most senior trainers there after being there for 4 years. My book of business was full. I had a waiting list. And you start thinking, man, this is where my life is really heading this time. But life's got a funny way of reminding us that our roadmap isn't necessarily always the roadmap. And it was about September of 2007, management changed over, and there were some changes in some personnel. And the new personal training manager introduced a non-compete. And that's not just exclusive to the personal training world, but in this case, it was slightly different, because if I had signed the non-compete at the time, you have to realize I was living in Roanoke, Virginia, with a population of about 100,000 people. And the non-compete had a radius of 25 miles from that location or their Botetourt location, which is about half an hour away. And so this 25-mile radius of either club really created this footprint that meant if anything ever changed, I would have to almost sell my house and relocate out of that town, that city, to a whole nother venue. And it just didn't logistically make any sense. And so I respectfully sat down with management. I explained my history. I'd been there for 4 years. I'd left for Australia and I'd come back. My clients had all come back, or most of them. You know, I'd invested time and effort into that club and into those relationships, and I wasn't planning on going anywhere. I had it good. I had all the amenities that I was enjoying every day. And at the time, I just said, listen, I can't really sign anything that might force, you know, my home, my family to relocate outside of this city. It just doesn't make any sense. And their answer was short. it was essentially, if you don't sign it, you're fired. Just like that. Click of the fingers, 4 years, full book of business, complete stability, security, gone. I remember saying, wait, so like now? I think it was a Tuesday. And they said, yeah, who you got coming in? I said, well, I've got like a 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. I mean, I worked into the evenings back then. I remember being there till 10 o'clock. My wife was in hospitality, so she finished late. And I remember being there from, sun up to literally not just sundown, but I was there while the cleaning crew were coming through. I was training people starting at 9 o'clock, working till 10. I mean, I was doing really well there. And I remember the answer being, well, give us their names and numbers. We'll call them and let them know that when they come in, they'll be training with somebody else. And I don't want to get caught because it's a recording here, but it was just absolutely gobsmacking at the time that they thought that's something that could happen to at that point, 4-year seasoned trainer in this place. I'm got a lot more to learn over the years, but at that time, I was the senior trainer at that club, and they were happy for me to just walk out the door and give my clients to somebody else that afternoon. Now, it was funny because I remember them calling some of my client list over the course of Wednesday and getting a lot of kickback. Now, I gave them the names, the numbers, and I didn't get in the way of it because I wanted to go out on good terms. But it was funny because as they called to everybody, they were getting an earful. They were getting an absolute tongue lashing on their decision. And it was funny because I had a client of mine that I was training, and his family. And he said, well, my brother and I do a lot of things together, and I believe in you, my family do. I'll talk to my brother and see if he wants to jump on board, working out with you. But what if we have a long-term game plan here of building our own personal training studio, and you can be a part owner of that with us? And so you look at that and you're like, man, 24 hours earlier, I'm coasting. I'm on cruise mode. I got everything I need. And a personal training studio is not even on my radar. And then bam, one conversation and everything changed, right? Now, the problem with that story is that I was really not going to have anywhere to work while we were building this studio. And so building a business obviously takes time, and I needed somewhere to train clients. And I remember standing there on Friday afternoon, clearing out my desk because they had actually called that Tuesday night and said, all right, you can finish out the week. They thought they were doing the right thing, but in all reality, it might have been the wrong thing for them, but that's hearsay, right? Because I'm clearing out my desk on that Friday afternoon and I'm putting all my stuff into a box. And all the trainers that had signed it, around, and we're all talking about whether that was the right decision or not. But I had a couple of people come up to me, a couple of trainers that I knew that worked out of a private studio, just around the corner. And they said, what's going on? I told them what had happened. And they said, well, why don't you just come and train out of our place? There's plenty of room. We work out here because we like to get out of our business and, change the scenery. But you're more than welcome to come over there and train clients or whoever you want to until you figure it out. It was no elaborate proposal or a 5-year plan. It was just, I was being shown the next step. And it's something that's taught me a lot over my life. You don't always get that, right? You don't get the entire roadmap. Sometimes you just get the next step, and you get one conversation or an opportunity, or a door opens or another one's closing, as we say. And so without me really having to even try or try at all, this is back in 2007, cell phones and communication wasn't as easy as it is today, but I wasn't recruiting anybody. I just went across to that facility and people found me. I mean, I had people knocking on the door and people telling each other where I was. And before you know it, all of my clients had moved across and started training with me out of this new facility. Everyone came except one. And eventually that one that didn't come with me ended up coming with me to 180 Fitness, the name of my personal training studio. And the motto of 180 Fitness was turn your life around. And so for nearly a decade, I had the privilege of owning my own studio with these awesome people. And when I look back and I tell that story, I could easily look back and say, see, getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me, right? Maybe, maybe not. The truth is, I don't actually know, because here's something that I've learned. I don't know what the other road would have looked like if I'd stayed in Australia. Maybe life would have unfolded beautifully there, right? Well, what if I'd signed that non-compete? Maybe another incredible opportunity out of signing it would have appeared. We don't know. But neither do you, right? Nobody speaking into your life knows. And so what I find amazing is just how much of our lives we actually can spend trying to solve those questions. And they can never actually be answered, right? What if I'd stayed? What if I'd left? What if I said yes? What if I said no? What if I had taken another job? What if I'd never gotten divorced? What if I hadn't gotten injured? What if I hadn't gone through bankruptcy, right? Maybe those aren't questions that we're actually capable of answering, because all we really have is that road, that chapter, that moment. And I think there's incredible freedom in accepting it, that once the decision's been made, and once life has started to unfold in front of you, there comes a point where constantly replaying it stops producing the wisdom, and it starts producing regret. So when I look back on my life at all the roads that ended and maps and bridges that were seemingly burnt in front of me, which is often the phrasing I've used when I tell that story, I didn't do it, right? I would have stayed there forever. And maybe I was meant to, maybe I wasn't meant to. But plans changed, dreams shifted, and I can spend the rest of my life analyzing that decision. Did I do the right thing? Should I have stayed? Should I have gone? What if I just signed that paperwork, and I was still in Roanoke, living on acreage? Should I have fought harder at the time? Maybe I should have left sooner. And I could spend decades doing that. And here I am, nearly 20 years later, talking about it, right? But if I do that, here's the problem. I would be judging a younger version of myself. I'd be using information to judge myself that I didn't have. I'd be, as they say, Monday morning quarterbacking, right? And I'd be doing that to a man that was simply doing the best that he could at the time, with the maturity, the wisdom, and all the information that he possessed at that time. Now, don't want to be misunderstood, because it doesn't mean I can't look back and learn. Of course I should. But when life presents me with something familiar again, now, because I've spent time looking back, maybe I'll recognize it this time around, right? I might respond differently. And I think that's the wisdom we're looking for, because looking back does have some value. And we can sometimes, if we're smart enough and put the effort in, we can start to recognize the pattern. We could say, man, I've been here before. I have seen this before. And last time I didn't handle it well, right? Last time I was here, I didn't do great. And so this time I'm going to do better, right? To me, that's the perspective that I'm talking about, because there's a huge difference between learning from that younger self and spending the rest of your life punishing that younger self, right? And I've thought a lot about that as I work through some material and some books I'm reading. I could sit down with that 25-year-old version of myself, Matthew, in 2007, or the 30-year-old version of myself, or 35, or the 40-year-old version. And I could really spend the whole conversation telling that version of myself, man, here's where you went wrong. Here's where you screwed it up. And I could shame him and tell him how many mistakes he made, how much he butchered, right? What he gave up by making those mistakes and those decisions. Or do I sit down next to me and I put my arm around and say, you know what? The same way I would do to my daughters now, right? My 4 and 6-year-old daughters. And I'd say, you know what? You're going to get some stuff wrong here. You're going to make some decisions that one day you might understand differently. And you're going to walk some roads that don't end up where you think they will, that you're guaranteed in your mind of experiencing. But keep walking, keep learning, keep taking responsibility, grow. Don't stop living just because you're afraid to make another mistake. Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life creating shame for a younger version of myself, right? Who was just trying to navigate life at the time the best that he could. I want to learn from that younger version of myself, right? I want to thank him because without his mistakes, I wouldn't possess the perspective that I now have today. As they say, youth is wasted on the young, right? We let go of the past without throwing away the lesson, right? The meat and the bones, right? You eat the meat off the bone, you throw away the bone. We can carry that wisdom forward. We don't have to drag all the regret with us, right? Because looking back isn't the problem. Living there is. And maybe one of the reasons life becomes so difficult, it becomes so challenging is because we don't just revisit the past, we build our identity there. We become the divorced one, or the injured one, the bankrupt one, the one who failed, the one who got betrayed, the one everybody's feeling sorry for all the time, right? And eventually, letting go of that chapter feels like you're letting go of yourself. And I've wrestled with that a lot. Maybe you have too. But I don't believe that the hardest chapter of your life was ever meant to become your permanent address. Now, it might explain part of who you are, but it doesn't have to define who you're becoming. And I've also realized that some of this might come more natural to me than others, right? I've always been adventurous. I've been curious. I've always wondered, okay, what else is possible? And I think, over the course of my life, I've, bought and sold 7 or 8 homes, and that average is slowing down. But there was a period there where I was really moving a lot, as I shared earlier, in just one version of it. So maybe you're not wired that way, and that's okay. You don't have to move across the world, right? You don't have to quit your job. You don't have to keep selling your house or moving back and forth. And sometimes that next chapter begins with just one conversation, and maybe that's what you need to do versus some of the stuff that I've done. I'm not promoting my decision-making process, but maybe for you, it's one apology or it's one application, right? It's one phone call. It's one class. It's one small decision that you can make that says, you know what, I'm willing to see. I'm willing to see what's on the next page of this story, right? And I think that our attitude matters, right? Those words that we continuously speak to ourselves, the words that come out of our mouth. Life and death is in the power of the tongue. If I constantly tell myself, man, nothing ever works out, this is just who I am, there's never any opportunities, eventually I begin looking for evidence to support that mindset, those beliefs. But if I remain open, if I remain teachable, coachable, if I remain hopeful, then I start to begin noticing things. And it's already happening behind the scenes of even this episode. It's just mind-blowing how it's unfolding. More to come on those things as they unfold. But if I'm not willing to notice those things and look for them, then I might have missed something that I might have missed before. And it's not because I magically created those things, but it's because I was finally maybe paying attention to that space, right? Sometimes we try so hard to control tomorrow because we're unwilling to let go of yesterday. But I've found for me personally that letting go often creates the freedom for the new opportunities to appear. I remember clearing out that desk like it was yesterday, thinking, it's okay, it's going to work out. And that doesn't mean grief just disappears, or heartache, or sadness for a time, right? It doesn't mean that loss doesn't hurt. And it doesn't mean that we stop remembering some of the things and the people that we love, right? From those chapters that we're letting go of. It simply means that we stop allowing what's happened yesterday to hold tomorrow hostage and only accept what's in our hands as this is the roadmap. And so, where does my roadmap lead now? Well, honestly, I don't know. Maybe I stay here. I'm in Florida. Maybe one day life takes me back to Virginia, a beautiful area and great people. I don't miss the cold, but acreage, maybe it's California. Maybe it's Australia. Maybe it's somewhere that I haven't even considered yet. And maybe to me, that's the point, right? I don't have to know every destination anymore. I just need enough courage to take that next step, because wherever life leads me, I won't arrive there as the same person as the one that left. I've lived too much life. I've got hopefully a lot of life left. And I've made a lot of mistakes, which I've documented, and there's plenty more I could share on too. Right? I've learned a lot of lessons. And I'm gaining more perspective every single day. Right? And maybe this episode's more about that. Right? Not pretending that yesterday hasn't happened, and not forgetting the people that we've lost, not ignoring that grief. I'm not denying any pain, but I'm refusing to read the same chapter over and over and over again ad nauseum, hoping somehow the ending's going to change. Because every single chapter of your life matters. And if you look for it, every season teaches you something, teaches me something. Some chapters are beautiful and some are absolutely heartbreaking. And if I get caught in those thoughts, I start feeling the emotions as if I was living it all over again. And there are some things in my life that I want to gladly live over, right? Other parts, other chapters, I would never choose to go through again. But eventually, every chapter asks us to turn the page. And maybe life is quietly asking you to do that today. Are you willing to find out what the next chapter holds? It may not be perfect, but neither was the last one. But you'll never discover it if you refuse to turn the page. So I encourage you to look back for perspective, look forward for possibility, and carry the wisdom, leave the regret, turn the page. Stop looking back. You're not going that way. Stay strong, everyone. I look forward to next week. Cheers.